Hello, and thank you very much for taking the time to see this presentation of my research. My name is Jeromy Mackey. I'm a senior English and theater major in the University Honors Program. And my presentation today will be called Staging Change, the Influence of Actors' Equity on Politics and Policy. Now, in choosing this subject matter for my thesis, I wanted to choose something that was interdisciplinary, since that's what the honors program has always been to me. I'm a theater student. I'm an English student. I'm involved in policy and governance going into grad school. And so I thought, what better than the Actors Equity Association, taking a look at trade unions in America in general, as well as the influence that Actors Equity has had on social issues and our policy and our politics in the country, even outside of theater. So some background information on equity. The Actors Equity Association was established in 1913 by 112 stage actors. There was a couple attempts before them to organize, and they had all failed. And so the actors kept trying, and they successfully organized in 1913 formally, though the union didn't take off until much later. Since then, they have fought diligently for the rights of their actors and their stage managers that they represent, as any union would, as well as for the greater civil rights of the population, with some events such as the 1919 strike, segregation, McCarthyism and the blacklist, the National Endowment of the Arts, and the AIDS epidemic. Now, I can't bring up all of those today in this presentation, but the paper will address that. But let me talk to you a little bit about what the research is and what the point of it is in this presentation. This deeply intersectional duty of actors' equity is indicative of the unique and unmatched influence on the commercial theatrical arts on society, policy, and politics, which is the overall research question I wanted to address with this thesis. How and why does theater have such a prominent role in our cultural and social progressive movements? So a little bit of information on labor unions that was required in my research to develop this project. I didn't know much about labor unions. As a college student, I wanted to learn more about what the history of these labor unions, since that's going to be really important in the role that Actors Equity as a labor union would play in developing these changes. So it's defined as a continuous association of wage earners for the purpose of maintaining and improving the conditions of their employment. Pretty straightforward. I'm sure many of the faculty in this room are part of ABSCUF, so you understand that the purpose of a union. Labor unions in America found their political footing in the leverage the federal government had in industry during World War I, because the industry depended so much on Woodrow Wilson and his push to industrialize and prepare for the war. The federal government was funding lots of that, so they got to have a bigger say in what goes and what doesn't go in the treatment of workers because of the leverage. And the advent of machinated automation and mass production, corporately driven to wrestle back some control led to hostile work conditions. Now, getting into the labor unions a little bit more, two important organizations that became one are the AFL and the CIO. The American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations merged in 1955. They were separate, and ever since then, they have been one kind of just giant conglomerate of the American Trade Union institution. AFL organized into craft unions, whereas the CIO developed a little bit later and divided labor by industry. And now the AFL and CIO together does the same thing. With that merger, like I said, the AFL and CIO became the ubiquitous oversight to labor unions. And just describing a little bit more, what it does is it is a federation of autonomous unions which serve as their spokesman and acts on matters which concern more than one trade or group of workers. Now, the reason I bring up AFL and CIO too is that the Actors Equity Association is a part of that organization. And so their legacy is tied to those. And I delve into that a little bit into the paper. The AFL and the CIO contain a lot of unions doing a lot of different social changes and social agendas. And so Actors Equity has had to navigate that as well in their push for social change. That's not so much touched on here, but it is really important in the paper. So like I said, the Actors Equity Association, the first successful, not the first, but the first successful labor organization movement for actors in America. It hoped to decide upon a uniform form of contract that would be alike, acceptable to the fair-minded manager and the fair-minded actor. It was this divide that was really the pushing force. Was you had all these different theaters, all these different production companies, and whatever company you worked for, whatever producer you worked for, they got to say how much you worked, what you got paid, overtime, all those things were decided individually. What they needed was they wanted to find something that wouldn't just, serve the actor, but the producer as well, something that they would benefit from because they know that that's what they would be driven by. It was formally founded without those 112 actors on May 26, with Francis Wilson as its first president. Wilson was chosen specifically because of his outspokenness against the Shuberts, which were the big theater syndicate and leader of production in the early 20th century in America. So it was definitely a strong political statement right out the gun of its activism by the Actors Equity Association. In addition to protecting the labor rights of actors and stage managers, the Actors' Equity has been a beacon of effective activism for social change. The entire purpose of this is determined why theater continues to be such an intersectional moment in progressive societal change. So this is a quote from one of my primary texts that I use, but this is referring to the 1919 strike, the greatest all-star mob scene ever seen. A little bit play on words there for the fact that they were all actors. But though formed in 1913, the Actors Equity Association strike in 1919 catalyzed the purpose and presence of this modern union. Though equity was nearly 1,000 members strong, it was still a middling outfit with little muscle behind it. Up to this point, the producers weren't taking it seriously. It was growing in size, but again, because there was no uniformity or actual regulated collective bargaining for the actors, then we still had these varying amounts of participation and recognition by the commercial community of theater. The strike occurred. It was a hugely organized effort by the ever-growing Actors' Equity. It occurred in 1919. The strike brought to a standstill the entire machinery of the American dramatic stage in the most prosperous year in the native theater's history. This is an important moment. This is where Actors' Equity gets leverage against first the theater industry, which would continue to increase its leverage in society as a whole. It doesn't do this when it's a bad year. You would think that maybe it would be more effective in a year where there wasn't making as much money, and so the strike would really hurt the producers because they were already struggling. No, it was pretty intentional that this happened in such a prosperous year because the managers knew what they were missing out on, and it was even more of a motivator than if they had been struggling. 18 shows went dark because of the strike, and 5 scheduled shows were abandoned. But at the time, Equity kept performing shows if you were part of the union. Now, to take a break here, this is an important aspect of Equity and its legacy and how it functions today is this idea of a closed door policy with it. These kind of policies occur in a lot of unions, but specifically with Actors' Equity, there is this sense of once you're in the union, you can't perform in any company that isn't recognized by Actors' Equity as a union once you've joined the union. And so it's this idea of like it's a closed off knit society. And what that did then was create, a pressure and an accountability to make sure that these safety and guidelines are being followed. But however, what it also did was it's kind of led to a level of exclusion and elitism that kind of affects some of the conclusions I come to at the end of the presentation. So now looking at those social changes, I have some examples here. Like I said, the paper goes into a greater depth, but this really kind of I'm going to summarize the key points. Equity consistently was at the forefront of racial justice and activism almost from its inception. Paul Robeson was the first Black man to play the title role in Othello. And what's wild to think about with this situation is that Actors' Equity made that choice at a time when Black Americans could not sit with white Americans in the audience while watching this man play Othello. Also, when they would book hotel rooms for their actors, they had to book separate hotels that were either integrated or completely Black to allow for the Black actors to reside, because a lot of the places wouldn't allow them to stay with white residents. So Actors' Equity made the decision while this was still going on, again, intentionally. And so instead of backing down, they established the Hotel Accommodations Committee, which was a organization set up within Actors' Equity to kind of put pressure on those hotel owners by saying, we're not going to not rent hotels. We're going to find hotels that take us, and we're going to hurt your business since you decided to do this, which was a huge push from Actors' Equity. And the DC National Theater was a huge production company that the Actors' Equity was supposed to perform at, and they decided they upped the ante and said that they would not perform at the DC National Theater if their Black actors were not accommodated in the way that they had required and were calling for across the board. And lastly, what they did really early on too in the early 50s was these integrated showcase demonstrations. So even pre-civil rights movement, they were having deliberate showcases of Black and white actors working together to show off the talent and the creativity and the skill being overlooked because of racial divides, which was a huge moment in pushing forward the image of inclusivity that Actors' Equity wanted to portray. Up next is actually a really interesting one that was the whole reason when I read this article is why I wanted to write this paper was on McCarthyism. So for a lot of you who don't know, the Hollywood and arts industry was pretty decimated by McCarthyism and blacklisting in the 1950s and 60s. McCarthyism obviously is the Red Scare, the list of communist sympathizers that kind of were politically motivated and got people banned and careers ruined and livelihoods taken away. And Actors Equity was the only major entertainment union to not ban suspected communists. There's a whole bunch of articles written about the Actors Equity response in comparison to other entertainment unions' responses. I like this quote a lot. In response to the ever-darkening landscape, the membership passed a strong resolution to blacklisting. Immediately, Active said, we are not jumping on this. They did that in 1951, which was still pretty early in the McCarthyist time period. And then the decades later, on the 50th anniversary of the blacklisting, this quote really stood out too. Richard Mauser, who was the president of the Screen Actors Guild, which used to be a part of Actors Equity, became their sister union, and then the McCarthyism happened. Only our sister union, Actors Equity Association, had the courage to stand behind its members and help them continue their creative life in the theater. For that, we honor Actors Equity tonight. So even these other unions who made the mistake and were reflecting on their mistakes at a night of reflection, chose to honor the activism by Actors Equity. And maybe the most famous instance of equity and their role in social change is the AIDS epidemic. So obviously, in our culture, the AIDS epidemic has often been connected with homosexual culture, a stereotype that the Broadway community and the professional theater community have tried to break. One of the first shows that happened was called The Best of the Best, a show concern. It was founded by 5 people who were decided like they were part of equity, and they said, why aren't we doing anything to help them? Because they had both known so many people personally who had passed away from the disease, and were frustrated that there wasn't a greater response. This quote was great and really showed the purpose behind it. 2 gay men and 3 straight women. That was pretty amazing to me. It wasn't a gay issue. It was about people. Now, this Best of the Best, the show concern, was a review of all these popular performers doing different kinds of shows and different bits to raise money to put towards AIDS research. This was extremely popular, and even though it started in 1985, it has continued to snowball, and eventually became Broadway Cares and Equity Fights AIDS, which Broadway Cares and Equity Fights AIDS are 2 separate organizations, one helping actors, one fighting AIDS through research. They would eventually merge as well, becoming a multilateral effort across professional theater made possible by the union's cohesion. And so these were 2 separate organizations, but because they were all union actors, they were able to kind of form this together under the union branch. And every year, Broadway Cares and Equity Fights AIDS raises millions of dollars to support the fight against AIDS, as well as professional actors struggling. They've been a huge instrumental role in keeping actors who have been out of work because of the COVID-19 pandemic, as much as they can, financially stable and successful during these dark times on Broadway. And here are the conclusions of this presentation. And I urge you, if you want to read the paper, I think it's interesting. What does it matter? We look at now, there's a cultural position that, actors in Hollywood don't necessarily speak for the quote unquote, the little guy. And as you can see, at least with Actors Equity Association, they've been at the forefront of issues we would all, agree on are the correct ones. And the ones that and continue to fight for, even when it was unpopular, even when maybe it wasn't something that represented the working class or that was being presented in propaganda. Why theater? Maybe it is because of the idea that these people are comfortable in a sense now, financially or culturally, that they have the courage and have the platform, I should say, to speak out on these issues. And with COVID-19, Actors Equity has continued to put out resources and curriculum, not just on the safety of COVID-19 in the theater space, but in general, because they know that's the only way to get these actors back on stage and keep the art alive. Which leads me to the final point, which is the future. Actors Equity is a strong and ever-growing association on the forefront of social change, fighting the COVID-19 pandemic, and them, including myself, are all really excited to see theater come back to the stage and see this social change continue to be pushed. And that is my presentation. If you have any questions, we have a Q&A on the University Honors Program discussion board post. And I look forward to hearing your questions. And thank you so much for your time with this presentation today.